Well, we're beginning the final cult in the entire series entitled Cults and the Occult. Before we do so, and this final topic will be done in 3 different lessons. The first lesson on this particular cult, more or less give you the history behind this, and then in the second lesson we'll start to compare what this cult teaches in regard to what our Bible teaches us, and then really what this particular cult has done with the culture. But let me read to you, beginning in Genesis 16. And in Genesis 16, beginning in verse 11, the angel of the Lord said to Hagar, "Further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all his brothers." For a number of us, we remember very well the terrorist attacks against the United States of America on Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001. On that day, those attacks catapulted Islam onto the front page of every newspaper and leading off every news broadcast that there was. If you knew nothing about Islam on that Monday, you knew about Islam come Wednesday. But that was, believe it or not, almost 25 years ago. Almost 25 years ago. And an entire generation of people were not there. And maybe there are some young people who were just born, but they're certainly not going to remember it. And so we have an entire generation of young people who honestly believe that Islam is a peaceful religion. And I'm here to tell you it is not. Islam is the world's youngest religion, and yet it is the second largest religion in the world. Now, here in the United States, prior to those terrorist attacks in the year 2000, there were approximately 3.5 million Americans who were practicing Islam. 20 years later, really nothing has changed all that much here. The numbers really have stayed about the same. But that's not the case in other places in the world. There are places in the world where Islam is growing and growing rapidly. Canada, for instance, Islam is growing tremendously. You have parts of Asia, Europe, the United Kingdom, and France and Germany, where Islam is just taking over. And so I'm going to use this first lesson, really, in giving you a history lesson. And I'm going to be actually reading from the Encyclopedic Dictionary. Now, I know it can be rather tedious to be listening to someone read, but once I saw the information that the Encyclopedic Dictionary and those authors put together in regards to this cult of Islam, I figured it would just be best if I take their information and relay it to you. After that, we'll also go ahead and I'll share some things as far as what Shiite Muslims are and what Sunni Muslims are and what they believe and what they teach. But without any further ado, here's just a brief overview. Our authors write, the founder of Islam was the Prophet Muhammad, born approximately AD 570 in Mecca. Accounts of Muhammad's childhood are sketchy. His parents died while he was very young, brought up by his uncle and grandfather as a shepherd. Young Muhammad later became a camel driver along the trade route between Syria and Arabia. At the age of 25, he married a wealthy widow, Khadijah. Before his marriage, he had been employed by Khadijah, who was 15 years his senior. His relationship with her resulted in his elevation to a position of prominence and status in wealthy Meccan social circles. Muhammad had encountered Judaism and Christianity on the trade routes, and for the next 15 years observed the degenerate state of religion and morals among his own countrymen. He often retreated to a cave on Mount Hira outside of Mecca, where he spent periods of time meditating and even contemplating suicide. These visits were possibly, of course, since he was less obligated to work with the camel caravan because of his wife's great wealth. During one of these visits to the cave in the year 610, Muhammad, now 40 years old, reported that he was visited by the angel Gabriel, who commanded him, quote, to recite in the name of the Lord, who had created man out of a clot of blood, end quote. The message he received later became the essence of the Quran. With the approval of his wife and friends, Muhammad arrived at the belief that he had been ordained a prophet, called to bring his people out of moral decadence, superstition, and polytheism. Muhammad began preaching that there was but one God and his name was Allah. Allah was the supreme deity, already familiar to the Bedouin tribes of northern Arabia. As he moved throughout Mecca, proclaiming that Allah alone was God, to the exclusion of all other deities, he met with extreme opposition. Some of his countrymen believed he was possessed by a jinn. Muhammad himself believed this at first, but he became even more convinced that he was truly a chosen prophet of Allah, concluding that the opposition he experienced was not unlike what Moses and Jesus faced. Shortly after the first reported vision, Gabriel reappeared to Muhammad, adding further disclosures. Opposition to him and his preaching continued, but at a much more dangerous level. His message was in contradistinction to the polytheism of his countrymen. Even more significantly, it ran counter to the hedonism and general belief of the time that the acquisition of wealth was the highest priority in life. Muhammad did not meet with total failure, however, having gained for his cause approximately 70 followers. It is interesting to note that the Arabian people, especially the Bedouin tribes, maintained a strict provincialism. They were not answerable to, obligated by, or interested in anyone outside their own tribal circles. Muhammad's initial followers were labeled as being weak, meaning that they were outside the particular tribe of Quraysh. Muhammad provided a meaningful identity for these social misfits. Historians often offer different reasons for the opposition Muhammad experienced. Some argue that his sharp criticism of polytheism threatened the merchant trade. The more commonly held view is that because many Meccans were beginning to at least listen to him deeply, respecting his character and wisdom, it was feared that the prophet one day would rise to political prominence, threatening the existing establishment. Khadijah died in AD 619. A sudden withdrawal of support from the clan that had been backing Muhammad put the prophet in certain danger and forced him to flee from Mecca to the neighboring town of At-Taif. Not finding an adequate following there, he secured the protection of another clan and returned to Mecca, where he met and married a widow named Sauda. Almost immediately following that marriage, Muhammad entered into a polygamous marriage to yet another wife named Aisha, the 6-year-old daughter of Abu Bakr, who would one day succeed the Prophet as the chief caliph of Islam. Muhammad subsequently married more wives, having a total of at least 9. Some sources argue that he had as many as 20 wives and some concubines. In 620, Muhammad entered into a relationship and negotiations with clans from the city of Medina, 300 miles north of Mecca. 2 years later, in what is known among Muslims as the Hijra, Muhammad left Mecca because of mounting persecution against his cause and took up residency in Medina with new clans whom he had gained by his side. The Prophet's experience in Medina began a new period in Muslim history. After settling into Medina, Muhammad organized raids, or razzias, on innocent caravans traveling to Mecca. The first razzias were unsuccessful, but he did eventually succeed with additional attacks. Having gained strength as a result of his conquering caravans, Muhammad now presented a significant threat to the city of Mecca. Jews living in Medina raised a cry of opposition against Muhammad, especially because the Prophet had made the audacious claim to be Allah's true prophet. Disappointed that the Jews rejected him, Muhammad instructed his followers to face Mecca when praying, rather than Jerusalem, which had been the traditional practice. He believed that facing Jerusalem would have attracted Jews to his cause. To this day, Muslims face Mecca in prayer, the act itself remaining a long-standing symbol of the hostility between Jews and Arabs. 8 years in, Medina proved to be sufficient time for Muhammad to rally substantial forces to promote his cause. From the years 624 to 630, his followers attacked and conquered villages in the region surrounding Medina. In 628, he attempted to make a pilgrimage to Mecca with 1,600 followers. The clans of Mecca were determined to check Muhammad and keep him from entering the city. He and his men were halted at Al-Hudaybiyah. After a few critical days, the tensions ceased and a treaty was signed between the Meccans and Muhammad. Part of the agreement was that the Muslims would be allowed to make the pilgrimage the following year in 629. Muhammad's power grew steadily, and the social, economic, and moral state of affairs in Medina was in sharp decline. In 629, the Treaty of Al-Hudaybiyah was broken through additional clan wars. Finally, in January 630, Muhammad, accompanied by 10,000 men, marched into Mecca. He was met by some of the Meccan leaders who surrendered to him with little resistance. Because he issued a general amnesty and later a generous pardon to his former enemies, many Meccans were won over to his cause and many followed him into future campaigns. Although all of Mecca did not convert to Islam, Muhammad purged Mecca of hundreds of its pagan gods and deities, thus establishing a monotheistic religion. His further razzias eventually led to his becoming the most powerful religious and political figure in Arabia. He was successful in uniting a federation of Arab tribes that eventually conquered the Byzantine and Persian empires, extending itself throughout northern Africa and Byzantium. Muhammad died in 632, just 2 years after his conquest of Mecca. His death immediately raised the issue of who would succeed him as the chief caliph. Abu Bakr, the Prophet's father-in-law, assumed the position for 2 years until his death in 634. Omar, another father-in-law, became the next caliph. Uthman became the third caliph from 644 to 656. These first caliphs set the stage for the long succession of caliphs throughout much of Muslim history. By the year 750, Islam has spread to China, the Indian Ocean, and as far as Morocco, and from there it invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 710. For the next 800 years, Islam occupied most of Spain and Portugal. In 732, Muslims marched into Gaul, France, seeking to conquer more of Western Europe, but this time their war-mongering acts failed. Charles Martel halted their onslaught at the Battle of Tours. Failing to conquer more of Europe from the west, they remained in the Iberian Peninsula, and by the time of the Reformation in Europe, the Muslim Ottoman Turks, led by the famous Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, were at the very gates of the Holy Roman Empire, besieging Vienna in 1529. Christians looked on the expansion of Islam with great fear. One person observed the phenomenon as, quote, a daily increasing flame, catching hold of whatsoever comes next, still to proceed further, end quote. Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire pleaded with the Lutheran foes to unite with Roman Catholics against their common enemy, the Turks. In 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had succeeded in expelling Islam from the Iberian Peninsula, establishing Roman Catholicism as the supreme religion. In an age of religious fanaticism, it is a well-known yet regrettable fact that both Christians and Muslims spilled much blood between them, and both also conducted continuous pogroms against the Jews. During and after the 16th century, Islam suffered a decline in its influence and ethical character. This was due partly to the rise of corrupt sultans, given not to the propagation of Muslim theology and leadership, but to hedonism and self-interest. Another reason for decline was the steady refusal of Muslims to learn from the West. With an Arab arrogance and superiority, Muslims turned away from Christian Europe, ignoring both the great wealth that Europeans were acquiring through establishing trade routes and the great scientific and cultural advances made during the Renaissance. Concerning the trade routes, the Muslim empires were all chiefly quote-unquote land empires. Europeans, particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish, used sea routes to bridge commercial and cultural gaps that eventually hastened the discovery and settlement of the Americas. The expansion of Islam during its first 1,000 years saw a division into three separate empires. The first was the Ottoman Empire, comprised chiefly of Turks. As noted above, it was the Turks who pressed westward into Europe in the 16th century. The second was the Mughal Empire, which established itself in India and consisted chiefly of Arab Muslims who came into India under the leadership of Akbar in 1500. Akbar was intensely interested in religion. After building the famous Hall of Worship, he tried eclectically to blend facets of Hindu thought with Islam. Akbar's interests proved, however, to be too intellectual for the people of India, and his quote-unquote divine faith, as it was called, never gained a serious foothold. The third distinct Muslim empire was the Safavid Empire of Persia, or modern-day Iraq and Iran. The Safavid Empire, like the Mughal, was also established in 1500. Under Abbas I, who reigned from 1587 to 1629, the Persian Empire grew in power and prominence. Again, that was from the Encyclopedic Dictionary. Certainly want to thank those authors for that. There are three major sects that we know of course, in, let's call it, unbelieving Judaism. Of course, those three sects would be Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Reform Judaism. Those are the three. Well, there are two sects within Islam. You have the Shiite Muslims and then the Sunni Muslims. Let's talk first about what the Shiite Muslims believe. And once again, we go to our authors, and they write, a dispute arose after Muhammad's death as to who would be the rightful successor caliph to the Prophet. The Shiites, or quote-unquote partisans, believed that Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law Ali was the rightful heir. This sect was extremely small until popularized by Safavid in Persia. Today, Shiites constitute approximately 10% of the Muslim world. Although small in number, they are highly visible and the most vocal of the sects. Shiite leaders are referred to by the title Imam. The Imams wield extreme spiritual authority over their subjects, seeking to uphold a strictly fundamentalist and fiercely authoritarian interpretation of the Quran. The obvious example of this in modern times was the leadership provided in the 1980s by the late Ayatollah Khomeini. He came to power in 1979 by overthrowing the late Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi in a matter not unlike what happened in medieval Europe's Holy Roman Empire, where the Roman popes exercised complete political and ecclesiastical control over much of Europe. Khomeini became the sovereign spiritual and political leader of Iran, rallying Shiites together around strict enforcement of the Sharia law. The beginning of his decade-long tenure in office was featured by the holding of a number of American hostages for 444 days, and shortly before his death, he regained additional international attention by issuing a death threat against Salman Rushdie, author of the Satanic Verses, which Khomeini and Shiites regarded as being blasphemous to the Quran. That's a quick look at Shiite Muslims. And again, they take up a very, what you would say, a small percentage of the Muslim world, like our author said, 10% or so. But like the author said, they are highly visible, they're certainly the most vocal, and they're certainly the most violent. And when you think about how many Muslims there are practicing Islam in the world, and then you think 10% of them are extremists, that's a frightening number. The other group, or the other sect, is the Sunni Muslims. Our authors write, a majority, or 90%, of all Muslims are Sunnites. In contrast to the Shiites, Sunnites are considered to be the mainstream traditionalists within the corpus of the Muslim world. They accept the first four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, as legitimate successors to Muhammad. Sunnites are radically different from Shiites from a political standpoint. While the Shiites view government as being a divine institution of Allah, thereby attempting to establish a theonomy on earth, Sunnites believe Muslim doctrines must be lived out within the context of existing earthly governments. On the whole, Sunnites are more tolerant of diversity, and therefore more able to adapt to divergent cultures throughout the world. Sunnite and Shiite Muslims have persecuted each other bitterly throughout the centuries. The hatred is not unlike the bitter religious wars that have plagued Christendom, particularly after the Reformation, when Roman Catholics and Protestants chose to settle many of their differences with the sword. The traditional clash between Islamic religion culture has resurfaced in the modern world. In the past 30 years, the politics and economics of oil have redefined life globally. The early 1970s marked the beginning of a new era. Billions of dollars poured into OPEC nations, particularly Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The result was an unprecedented prosperity and wealth. The huge dependence of the United States on Middle Eastern oil made for an economic relationship between the United States and the oil-producing nations. This has complicated world politics because the United States is a supporter of Israel, which traditionally all of the Middle Eastern countries in varying degrees have opposed. Further, when Iraq invaded Kuwait under the leadership of Saddam Hussein in 1991, the United States, with its huge oil interests at stake, swiftly pushed back the invasion in the Gulf War. This muddied the waters even more because some of the Islamic countries, because of business and economic interests, found themselves pitted against other Islamic countries. Islam opposes these broken ties both ideologically and religiously. The United States came to be viewed as the evil empire, the great Satan, that brought about this divided house. This division, among other factors, helped set up the conditions that resulted in the growth of terrorist organizations and the eventual rise to power of Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network, which has declared war, otherwise known as jihad, on the United States. End quote. I'm going to read to you as well. Here's an article. It was written by Marvin Olasky. You can find it, actually, it was written only about a month ago or so, June the 30th, 2025. If you can go online, it's called What Christians Should Know About the Two Islams. And it's found in Christianity Today. You can find that article online. What Christians Should Know About the Two Islams. Let me read to you from the article, and that will conclude our first lesson for this particular topic. Olasky writes, quote, to understand Islam, we need to understand its major divisions, Sunni and Shiite. One way to start is to grasp the dueling significances of a major Islamic holiday, Ashura, which was on Saturday evening and Sunday, July 5th and 6th. Ashura is unusual because for some of the 89 to 90% of Muslims worldwide who are Sunni, it's a modest day of celebration. But for the 10 to 13% who are Shiite, it's a volcano of mourning. For some Sunnis, Ashura commemorates the day Noah's family left the ark. Joseph gained release from prison. God parted the Red Sea at the behest of Moses and other great events. For Shiite Muslims, Ashura is a day to mourn the death of Muhammad's grandson, Hussein ibn Ali, and most of his male relatives at the Battle of Karbala in modern-day Iraq in AD 680. Imam Yahari Abdul Malik, former Muslim chaplain at Howard University, said, "The dueling interpretations of one day make for an odd fit." Quote, "One Muslim community is saying Happy New Year, while the other is saying it's so sad that our beloved Hussein was murdered. All Muslims are observing something on Ashura, but the spirit of it is quite different." The Sunni-Shiite split is most evident in the Cold War between Saudi Arabia, Sunni, and Iran, Shiite. Since 2014, it is a hot war by proxy in Yemen. In the United States, most Muslims are Sunnis and are comfortable living as a minority as long as they can abide generally by the Quran and the Hadith, with interpretations and applications provided by a consensus of Muslims. When I taught a journalism and religion course at the University of Texas at Austin soon after 9/11, 2 Sunni Muslim students in my class impressed me with their thoughtful analyses of tensions. On 9/11, one Sunni extremist, Osama bin Laden, became infamous, and he and other al-Qaeda members were outliers. Most Sunnis say that so long as a government does not prevent Muslims from carrying out their ritual duties, it should not be described as anti-Islamic, and no attempt should be made to overthrow it. Abu Hanifa, a major Sunni thinker more than a millennium ago, said, quote, "Those who face in the direction of Mecca at prayer are true believers, and no act of theirs can remove them from the faith," end quote. Other Muslims, though, hope for Sharia, the complete rule of Islamic law. Some of the ardent yearn for a Muslim government similar to the original caliphate, which they say was just a system which leaders gained authority by consensus. Others opt for autocracy. Outliers argue for violence to achieve a dictatorship of the perfectly righteous. Shiites believe descendants of Muhammad's nephew Ali, who married Muhammad's daughter Fatima, should rule because they were part of the Prophet's bloodline. They also believe Allah gave Muslims a succession of imams, perfect teachers, up to the 12th, known as the Mahdi or Guided One. Most Shiites believe that this last imam disappeared, entered what is called occultation, and will return in days of chaos before the Last Judgment to implement God's rule. Iran, the largest Shiite nation, currently views its supreme leader as the Mahdi's representative on earth. Ashura comes in the Muslim month of Muharram, which includes the anniversary of the martyrdom of the 4th Shiite Imam, Ali ibn al-Hussein al-Shazad, believed to have been poisoned to death during Islam's 1st century. The history of imams generally is not a happy one. The wife of al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, the 2nd Shiite Imam, purportedly poisoned him. The 7th, 8th, 10th Ali al-Hadi, and 11th Hassan al-Askari Imams also supposedly died by poison. Some say a sense of oppression and threat is fundamental in Shiite Islam. On Ashura, Shiites reenact the quote-unquote martyrdom of Hussein. Near the battle site in Karbala, they reenact the burning of tents by Hussein's victorious enemies and the capture of women and children. There and elsewhere on Ashura, dirge-chanting mourners process through the streets, sometimes flagellating themselves. In Karbala on Ashura afternoon, mourners walk barefoot to the shrine of Hussein. Sunni extremists have sometimes piled on the psychology of grievance by turning Ashura into a day of violence. 2 centuries ago, Sunni radical Ahmad Barelvi preached against Ashura practices and claimed he destroyed thousands of Shiite ritual mourning structures. On Ashura in 2004, a suicide car bomber rammed the funeral march to the Hussein's shrine and killed more than 50 worshippers. Stories tell the toll, year after year, such as the bomb explosion in a Pakistani Ashura procession in 2009, or 2 separate bomb explosions among Ashura mourners in Afghanistan in 2011. Perhaps in reaction to Shiite mourning, some Sunni scholars over the centuries publicized Ashura as a joyous time, when believers should shout their delight. By AD 1300, some Sunnis bathed, dressed up, and shook hands prolifically on Ashura. To this day, many Sunnis in North Africa emphasize Ashura as a day for bonfires, charity, and carnivals. Last year in New York City, the Shiite view of Ashura gained the most publicity. Middle East Eye reported, quote, carrying shrouds, beating their chests, and chanting the names of those killed at Karbala, the cortege was led by men largely dressed in black. There were groups chanting in Farsi, Urdu, and Punjabi between the haunting, rhythmic thumping of chests as mourners faced each other and periodically let out the name of Hussein or Karbala in remembrance. Well, that was a lesson on really the history of where Islam came from, and of course tried to give you somewhat of an overview and understanding of Shiite Muslims and Sunni Muslims. In our next lesson, we'll start to really dig into doctrine and what Islam doctrine is concerning God and Yeshua the Messiah and salvation, in comparison with Christianity and Holy Spirit and atonement and all of those things. And that will be in our next lesson, which will follow.